So what do you think men did historically? Like, what do you think their jobs were? Like 1800s, what were your choices as a man to do as a job? Because, you always talk about how women were held back historically. So I'm asking, like, what was life like back then?
Well, women had to stay home and men had to do all of the jobs because they didn't allow women to help them.
What were their jobs that they did? What were the most common methods of employment back then?
I mean, what do you mean? I mean, it's going to be construction, it's going to be medicine, it's going to be food production, it's going to be factories, it's going like the same thing that runs all of society.
So they had three choices: coal miner, farmer, factory worker.
Nothing else happened in society.
I'm not saying nothing else. That was the majority of how people were employed.
Mm-hmm.
So you guys have this like rewritten history where you guys think that men just had these glamorous, fun jobs, but men did the difficult job. Men know that they didn't enjoy their jobs. Do you think any guy is going to a coal mine and saying, wow, this is my passion?
And again, who set that system up?
It's not about who set it up. It's how would the system run without it? They need coal. At the time, they needed coal. Like the same way now, somebody has to build the buildings. Somebody has to get the food. Otherwise, society does not run.
Let's talk about this common claim that women, historically, were held back by men, prevented from working, and denied the opportunity to contribute equally to society. It's a statement you'll hear over and over, not just from feminists, but from mainstream culture, movies, books, and casual conversation. The idea is that women could have been just as capable, just as innovative, just as important to the progress of civilization as men, if only men hadn't kept them in the kitchen, barefoot and pregnant, locked out of the world of work and achievement. It sounds simple. It sounds convincing. But the reality, like most things, is both more simple and more complex at the same time. The truth is this: men themselves were brutally limited in what they could do for the vast majority of history. The idea that men were sitting on a mountain of privilege, sipping wine and smoking cigars while holding women down, is a fantasy. Historically, most men weren't inventors, kings, or philosophers. They weren't scientists or statesmen. They were breaking their backs in fields, suffocating in coal mines, mangling their bodies in factories, or being sent off to fight and die in wars they had no choice in. The freedom men supposedly had was, in reality, a lifetime of dangerous, exhausting, soul-crushing labor. So if we're going to talk about women being held back, we have to be honest. We have to look at what everyone, both men and women, were up against, and why history played out the way it did. Let's start by looking at men's lives throughout history. Because if you buy into the feminist narrative, you'd think every man had the chance to be a Newton or a Shakespeare, while women were chained to the hearth. But let's look at reality. Take the coal mines of the 18th and 19th century Britain. Boys as young as 6 were sent underground, hauling carts of coal in darkness for 12-hour shifts. Many died before reaching adulthood from lung disease, cave-ins, or exhaustion. These weren't privileged aristocrats. They were men and boys with no choice, condemned to brutal work so the industrial economy could run. Or take farming, which was the livelihood of the vast majority of humans for thousands of years. Farming was back-breaking work. Sunup to sundown, no weekends, no safety net. You prayed the harvest was good, because if it wasn't, your family starved. This was men's privilege. And then there's war. Conscription has been a feature of nearly every society that ever existed. From the Spartan phalanx to the trenches of World War I, men have been forced to fight and die. Do you think the French peasants who marched into battle at Agincourt felt privileged? Do you think the millions of young men gassed, shelled, and slaughtered in the First World War were enjoying their freedom while women were supposedly held back? The idea that men, as a class, were living in luxury while women were uniquely oppressed is historically absurd. Even the Industrial Revolution, which feminists sometimes frame as a moment when men surged ahead and women were left behind, wasn't some golden age for men. Sure, new jobs opened up in factories, railways, and steelworks. But they weren't glamorous jobs. They were grueling, dangerous, and often deadly. Men lost limbs in machinery, suffocated in steel mills, or died young from exhaustion. And keep in mind, wages were pitiful. Working-class men weren't living better than working-class women. They were just enduring different hardships. Here's something feminists don't like to acknowledge. For most of history, almost no one was educated. In medieval Europe, literacy rates were abysmally low. By some estimates, fewer than 10% of men could read or write before the Renaissance. Universities like Oxford or Cambridge weren't filled with average men. They were filled with the sons of nobles and clergy, the absolute elite. If you were a peasant boy, you weren't getting an education. You were learning to plow fields, swing an axe, or shoe a horse. Your sister wasn't barred from school by patriarchy. Neither of you were going. You both worked the land. Even well into the 1800s, the majority of men couldn't dream of upward mobility. They weren't running governments or writing books. They were barely surviving. So when someone says, women were held back from education, the real answer is, so were men. Both genders were locked into the brutal economic reality of their class. It wasn't some global conspiracy of men against women. It was the fact that life itself was unforgiving, and only a tiny elite had access to learning or influence. Look at France before the Revolution. You had nobles and clergy who enjoyed education and privilege, but the vast peasantry, both men and women, were illiterate, hungry, and overtaxed. Men weren't privileged oppressors. They were just as trapped as the women in their villages. This pattern repeats across history. Whether it was medieval serfs, 19th century factory workers, or soldiers conscripted into empires, the vast majority of men had no path to intellectual greatness. They were too busy surviving. Another myth is that women were confined to the home and prevented from contributing to society. That's not true. Women worked, and their work mattered. On farms, women played a vital role in planting, harvesting, food preservation, and animal care. In cottage industries, they spun wool, wove textiles, brewed beer, and contributed to the household economy. In cities, women were midwives, healers, seamstresses, and merchants. Take medieval Europe. Women in guild families often worked alongside their husbands, helping to run businesses and train apprentices. In textile production, women were absolutely essential. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, and you'll find women working in textile mills, match factories, and as domestic servants in huge numbers. They weren't excluded from the workforce. They were a fundamental part of it. Even in the 20th century, the famous Rosie the Riveter propaganda during World War II framed women as suddenly allowed into factories. But the truth is, women had always worked in factories. What changed was that men were drafted into war, and women were asked to temporarily fill the male-dominated heavy industries. As soon as the war ended, most women chose not to continue factory labor, preferring less dangerous, less grueling work. So the narrative that women were shut out of the workforce until feminism came along is false. Women were always working. They were just working in different capacities, often shaped by biology and practicality. And here's where the uncomfortable truth comes in. Men and women are different, biologically, physically, psychologically. Men evolved to take on risk, aggression, and physical labor. Higher testosterone means greater muscle mass, greater endurance in combat, and a higher propensity for risk-taking. This isn't social conditioning, it's biology. That's why men, across cultures and eras, ended up in the coal mines, the battlefields, the shipyards, and the steel mills. That's why men dominate extreme achievement in invention, exploration, and science. Not because women were barred, but because men are wired for extremes. Higher highs, lower lows. You see it in IQ distribution. Men are overrepresented at both ends of the bell curve. More geniuses, more fools. Women cluster closer to the average. That doesn't mean women aren't intelligent. It means men are more likely to dominate the extremes, which is exactly where invention, discovery, and radical societal change occur. This isn't oppression, it's biology. And no amount of feminist revisionism can erase the role evolution played in shaping human society. Here's the ultimate debunking of the held-back myth. Look at modern society. Today, women can do anything. They can study any subject. They can take any job. No laws bar them. No system prevents them. If they truly were held back for centuries, then we should now see women flooding into all the previously male-dominated fields, dominating them as they should have all along. But what do we see? Women overwhelmingly choose careers in healthcare, education, HR, psychology, fields that are people-oriented, nurturing, and safe. Nothing wrong with that. But it's not STEM, not heavy labor, not military leadership. Even in hyper-progressive countries like Norway and Sweden, where gender equality is pushed to the maximum, women are less likely to enter STEM than in more traditional societies. This is called the gender equality paradox. When women are free to choose, they don't choose the same things men do. Meanwhile, men still dominate engineering, computer science, physics, and invention. Not because women are blocked, but because women generally aren't interested in or driven toward those fields at the same rates as men. And notice this. Women today are still not flocking to coal mines, oil rigs, or construction sites. Men still do the dirty, dangerous jobs that keep civilization running. If women were truly eager to contribute equally, why aren't they lining up for those roles? The answer is obvious. They never wanted those roles. And historically, they weren't held back from them. They simply didn't want them, and biology didn't push them toward them. Look at Sparta. Spartan women had far more rights and freedoms than in most of the ancient world. They could own property, they were educated, and they were physically trained. But despite this, Spartan innovation, military power, and cultural achievements were all driven by men. The women were important, yes, but they didn't match men in contribution to the broader world. Look at the Soviet Union. After the revolution, the USSR forced women into the workforce in every sector, including heavy industry. For decades, women worked side by side with men in mines, steel plants, and collective farms. But as soon as the system allowed choice, women left those jobs in droves, preferring less brutal, less dangerous work. Or look at the American frontier. Survival wasn't about men holding back women. It was about everyone doing what they had to do to live. Men hunted, built, and fought. Women managed households, raised children, and worked alongside men in fields. It wasn't oppression. It was division of labor based on practicality. The myth that women were historically held back gained steam in the 20th century with writers like Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan. But their accounts weren't neutral history. They were ideology. They reframed history to fit a narrative of female victimhood and male oppression. Hollywood reinforced it with endless movies showing girl boss warriors, rewriting the past to fit modern feminist fantasies. But history wasn't a Marvel movie. Women weren't elite soldiers or inventors-in-waiting held back by sexist men. They were part of the same struggle for survival as men, just in different roles. So let's return to the claim that women were held back by men and could have been just as good in every aspect of society if only they'd been allowed. The reality is this: men weren't free. Men were trapped in war, labor, and survival. The majority of men had no opportunity for greatness themselves, let alone the power to hold women back. Women weren't locked out of society. They contributed. Through work, through family, through community. But biology, practicality, and survival shape their roles differently than men's. And today, when women are free to do anything, they still don't flock to the dangerous, dirty, or extreme roles that men take on. They still choose differently. The feminist narrative isn't just wrong, it's insulting. It erases the sacrifices of men who bled and died in fields, mines, and wars. It pretends history was a gentleman's club, where all men thrived while women were locked out. The truth is far harsher. History was brutal for everyone. Men weren't holding women back. Life itself was. And the fact that men, in spite of that, built civilization, advanced science, and carried humanity forward isn't a story of oppression. It's a story of sacrifice.